Okay, this is game six between these gentlemen here, Magnus Carlsen on the left and Jan Nepo. I can't really say his last name very well. If he wins the world championship, I will learn how to say his name, but otherwise, I will, yeah, not many people actually try to say Nepo's actual last name. You can see it written here. Nepo, yeah, right there. So this is game six. This was a world record game and very instructive. We're really going to look at pawn structures in this one. So, of course, in the opening, we're supposed to be controlling the center of the board. That's the main goal. Main strategy in chess is center control. And, like all strong players have different strategies to take advantage of the center of the board. You want to develop your pieces efficiently. You want to have some pawn presence in the center of the board, get your knights and bishops involved. We see that happening here. Both players castled by move 5 already, so definitely want to think about king safety. I have a lot of students that will neglect their kings and not castle, and this is not a good idea. You can see the greatest players in the world here, both castled by move 5 here. And, speaking of pawns, Black has a bit of an advantage in the center here now. They have two pawns versus one, so that's kind of a nice opening for Black. Not often do you get an advantage like this. When I saw this move, I initially thought it was a bit of a strange move by the world champion because, well, if pawn captures and pawn captures back, well, this is sad pawn structure. This is not any good. These pawns are isolated. The pawns, they like to be able to hold hands with each other, hang out with each other, and that would not be possible if this happened. But that's not what Magnus did. Instead, he played this pin here. So you always want to keep track of loose pieces, and this bishop is loose. So if pawn captures, well, they lose their bishop. Or Jan loses his bishop. So that's not what happened here, of course. Jan did not capture because he did not want to lose his bishop. And Magnus is able to maneuver around and keep his pawns happy, keep his pawns connected. So a bit of dancing around now, and now we have a fully developed position. This is both players are now in middle game. You want to get, like I said, you want to get your knights and bishops into the game, and you also want to get your rooks connected if you can, so they're kind of defending each other. So at this point, we can say we're officially in middle game and let the action begin. And a capture very early in the middle game. And, this could be a problem later on in the game. These somewhat isolated, well, this pawn is definitely isolated. And if this pawn ends up going missing, well, then it's going to be a big problem for Black. So just kind of zipping along here. This is okay. So like I said, this is a world championship game. This is the longest game in world championship chess history. So we're going to kind of zip through the middle game because, well, there's a lot of endgame to go over here. And one thing I want to point out is that a queen is only worth 9 points and 2 rooks are worth 10. So the world champion here actually trades his rooks for the queen, and then he's going to demonstrate why 2 rooks are better than a queen. We'll see that here after a few pawn trades. So just kind of zipping through this game here because, like I said, the world's longest world championship game. And they end up trading off a couple pawns here. Okay, and now this A pawn could be of major concern for Magnus Carlsen, for white. Obviously, that pawn might be able to become a queen, so a very dangerous pawn. And they end up doing a pawn trade here, so this move is played, and which gives up that pawn, but you need to keep track of loose and semi-loose pieces. So we had the loose bishop earlier that Magnus pinned and saved his pawn structure. And now the rook defends this bishop, or the rook attacks the bishop, I should say, and the queen defends. So it's a semi-loose piece. So that actually frees the knight to go ahead and capture the pawn. Now, it would be terrible for Black to go ahead and capture that because now the bishop falls, and how are we going to defend that pawn? There's no way to defend the pawn. The 2 rooks can pile up on that pawn and win it. There's no way to save that pawn. And actually, there would be no way to save any of these pawns. The rooks would just systematically pile up, and That would be all there is to it. Of course, the king could help defend, but so could white's king. But notice black's pawns. They are all very sad. None of them can help each other. They're all isolated pawns. We've got double pawns on the F file. Meanwhile, look at white's pawns. Look at the world champions pawns. Those pawns are very happy. They're all holding hands with each other, singing kumbaya. They're in it together. They're very strong together. They can prevail. Where black's pawns are just very, very sad. Those are unhappy pawns. That's not what happened in the game, though. Jan is not a fool, so he realized that would happen. He did not take the knight. He could not take the knight because that would just be the end of the game, basically. He would end up losing. So he continues to kind of maneuver around, and Magnus is trying to capture that pawn. He really would like to get the pawn. The interesting thing is, actually, if Magnus could trade his rook for this pawn and the bishop, he would still be winning. And it's because of the pawn structure. If these pawns were better, if this pawn was here or something like that, it would be a different story. But because this pawn structure is so bad, it would be fine for Magnus, for white, to trade his rook for a pawn and a bishop. Normally the math doesn't work out. I mean, you're trading 5-point piece for 4 points of material. But the rook and the other rook and the knight can pile up on these pawns one by one and pick them off. So that would be a big problem for black. Okay, so we can continue on here. A bit of maneuvering. And Magnus trying to get maybe his knight over there, but that doesn't quite work. And now this was a surprising move by by Magnus. Surprised Jan when he played this move. There was an expression of surprise on his face, which I was surprised to see this surprise, because obviously Magnus was planning on doing that. And so Jan Nepo, took some time thinking about this move, and he actually found the best response to this move. He captured this pawn here. That's a free pawn because of the absolute pin of the pawn. So basically it ends up being a pawn trade, because now, of course, the bishop can't take the rook because the queen would fall, so Nepo has to reposition his queen, and the rook is saved. And again, we have these terrible pawns versus these fantastically connected pawns. And that's really the difference in this game. It's really hard to convert this to a victory. That's why this is the longest game in World Championship chess history, and we'll see how Magnus pulls this off. So the thing is, it's 3 pieces versus 2 pieces. That's what it's going to come down to. And actually, the bishop is not going to be a lot of help in a lot of situations here, especially after the pawns are pushed. So now this was a bit of a mistake, because now the bishop can't help defend any of these pawns. The queen is the only defender for all 3 of these pawns, because they're on light squares now, and that is going to cost some pawns. And it takes a lot of maneuvering here. At one point during the game, I saw Magnus staring at his scorecard. It was his move, and he's looking at his scorecard, and he's trying to figure out if there's going to be a threefold repetition situation. So if all the pieces are in the exact same places, 3 moves in the game, it doesn't matter if they're separated by dozens of moves, but if the position repeats itself with all the pieces in the exact same spot 3 times, that is a draw by threefold repetition. So Magnus was trying to figure out if that was happening. Now, if you push a pawn or capture a piece, that of course changes, because the pawn couldn't have been in that position before. Pawns can't go backwards. And if something is captured, obviously the board is not the same. So a bunch of dancing around here to try to get position. And now one of the rooks is in the right place to win a pawn, and eventually he gets the other rook. So obviously this pawn is going to fall. There's no way to defend that pawn anymore. And Magnus eventually takes the pawn. And interestingly, he actually sacrificed, so he got an extra pawn here. He actually sacrifices his rook to create a fork and win the bishop as well. And now it's 2 pieces versus the queen. And, well, of course, these 2 extra passed pawns. Those passed pawns are a big deal. There's also another draw situation you could have, draw by 50 move rule. So if no pawns are pushed, if nobody moves a pawn and nobody captures a piece for 50 moves, this is also a draw. So I've seen students like checking kings all over the place. It's check, 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 check. Well, those students need to know about the draw by the 50 move rule. So again, if a pawn is not pushed and a piece is not captured for 50 moves, this would be a draw. And so this is another thing that actually kind of comes up in this game as a possibility if Magnus doesn't eventually push a pawn here. So he's got to watch out for perpetual check. Black would like to put white in check over and over and over again and possibly force a situation with threefold repetition. Of course, Magnus, the world champion, is not going to allow this. Eventually, he's going to work himself into a position where he can push a pawn. It takes him a while to get that position. He eventually brings his knight all the way back to G1, so he can move it to E2 to block some of these checks. And this is like dozens of moves, so the 50 move rule thing becomes a possible problem. And now finally a pawn push. So at this point then, there's no possibility of draw by threefold repetition because that pawn has never been there before. So it doesn't matter if the other pieces end up being in the same position they've been 10 times. The pawn was on E3 before and now he's on E4. So no possibility of threefold repetition, no possibility of 50 move rule. Everything starts again. And eventually Magnus is able to work his pawns up the board here. He just stoically continues to improve his position and tries to, and it pays really close attention to the possibility of perpetual checks, keeping his pawns protected. But those connected pass pawns are a really powerful thing, and it ends up being too much for the challenger to handle. Eventually, he just has to kind of give up, but we're not quite there yet. And he actually resigns here. It does seem like there's a lot of checking moves here, but it doesn't matter if the queen kind of checks back and forth, the king can kind of make his way back down and eventually over here behind his knight, shielded by his knight, and there will be no more checks. So there was probably only maybe a dozen to 15 moves left before this game would have been over anyway. But in this position, Nepo actually resigns the game, and this was the first victory for classical chess since 2016. So Magnus Carlsen faced against Caruana back in 2018, and that was all draws. So the 12 games they played, they were all tie games in the classical time frame. So nobody has actually won a game in classical world championship chess since 2016. So this game 6 was that first win. And like I said, a world record game, 136 moves before Black resigned this game. Anyway, that's game 6. Magnus Carlsen has a significant lead now. It does not look like Nepo is going to have a chance. He now has to win the next 4 games. That's the only option. He has to win 4 games to win the world championship. And winning 4 consecutive games against Magnus Carlsen is as close to impossible as I can imagine. So anyway, yeah, that's game 6. Thank you for watching. And I will be doing videos on game 8 and game 9 as well. So stay tuned for that. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.